Welcome to San Diego Integral, April 8th, 2023. Our topic today, the Synthesis School of Integral Philosophy, presented by Steve McIntosh.
Welcome to San Diego Integral. I'm Tom Habib, and I'm a member of the San Diego Integral leadership team. We have an exciting presentation today. As you know, we have Steve McIntosh with us today, and he's going to be speaking on the Synthesis School of Integral Philosophy. Always a challenge to bring it into real world application. We will begin shortly, but first I wanted to mention that we'll be recording this meeting. If you prefer not to be seen, you can turn your camera off, although we love to see your faces. The link will be posted on Meetup a day or two after the event, and it's also on SDI's YouTube channel. So if you find that, you can find all previous meetings we've had, and our YouTube channel is growing. You can also find information on future events on sandiegointegral.org, on Meetup and Facebook. The advantage of joining one of these groups is that you'll automatically be notified when a new event is added, and we don't give away your email or anything like that. If you ever have questions or comments about these meetings, you're welcome to contact anyone on the leadership team. Next month, on May 13th, we will have our own Karen Voorhees presenting on the SDI meeting. Finally, we would like to invite small donations, which help cover the costs of hosting and some of the developments of these programs. You can make that donation on sandiegointegral.org, all one line. A few details about meeting today. If you have questions and answers for this, you're welcome to either unmute your mic to speak, or if you're more comfortable, you can raise your hand using the raise your hand button that on a laptop or desktop, this button is on the lower right edge of your screen. If you're on a phone or tablet, you may need to touch the screen to activate the menu at the bottom. And you can find it under More, apparently. We also have chat hosts who are checking the chat in case you have a question as we go. We don't shut down the chat. Before we begin, we'd like to welcome new people. If you're new, please unmute yourself and tell us your name, where you're hailing from, what town, and how did you hear about San Diego Integral? So is anyone here new today?
Hey, I'm Jonathan Logan in Portland, Oregon, and I'm not sure where I heard of it, but glad to be here.
Welcome, Jonathan. You found us. Welcome. Anyone else? Hi, Eric. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Good to meet you. My name is Eric Nolan. I'm an educational researcher in the Bay Area.
Welcome,
Good to be
Eric. Here. Anyone else? Now you new?
No.
You look pretty new.
Kat is raised your hand.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Kat Bloom, and I'm in Boulder, Colorado. And I don't know what I was searching on in the Meetup area, but I found you all related to that search criteria. So, yeah.
See, that was spirituality blowing through the internet.
That's right.
Brought us to you.
It's everywhere.
Anyone else? Okay.
This is Barbara. I'm actually here in San Diego County. And I also found it's through Meetup, probably because there was a malfunction in Meetup. And I had to search more than I wanted. I saw it. Thank you.
Welcome, Barbara. Okay, I think we got everyone. Do you see anyone new?
Somebody named Barbara is coming in right now.
Hi, Jesse from Down Under. Okay, so without further ado, today's topic is the Synthesis School of Integral Philosophy. And I would like to introduce my esteemed colleague, Steve McIntosh. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be with you all here. Thanks very much for showing up tonight and for your interest in this work. I've identified as what you might call an integralist for about 25 years now. It was really in 2000 that I realized that this was my calling. And part of that realization was a lifelong longing for what you might call a cultural renaissance. I've been fascinated by the periods in history where there's been a kind of a cultural fluorescence or, kind of a moving forward. And this is something that I've been very interested in. Here in Boulder, Colorado, where I live in the 90s, it felt like there was kind of a spiritual renaissance going on. We now look back at that as the New Age movement and don't really wish to be identified with it. But at the time, in the early 90s especially, it really felt like there was a kind of a quickening of culture. But after being within that movement for over 10 years, I began to grow somewhat disillusioned with it, with the magical thinking and the commercialism. And it was around that time that I started to become acquainted with integral philosophy. And I was especially, I got a big light bulb when I read the book Spiral Dynamics in 1999, because what it did, we were trying to discover what this next emergence of culture would be. And we just assumed that it was the mainstream, modernity, and then there'd be some kind of holistic worldview that would emerge beyond that. And that's sort of how it was conceived when what we now call the progressive postmodern worldview, in the color jargon, it's green. When we first began to recognize that this was an authentic cultural worldview, right, a major segment of American culture that could be compared and contrasted with both a religious traditional culture and secular modernist culture, that was a big aha moment for all of us. Paul Ray was the original sociologist who did the research and then published his findings, and he called the group the cultural creatives. And of course, he glorified it. And for a while, we were really happy to identify ourselves as cultural creatives. But there was something about it that didn't quite sit right with me. And then when I encountered Spiral Dynamics in '99 and really saw how Graves, as popularized by Beck and Cowan, had really shown how there was this progressive postmodern worldview, but there was something that came after it. And indeed, each one of these worldviews were related to each other in a kind of a dialectical relationship, right? So that there was a transcending and including that went on. And this is directly described my experience, my cultural experience in trying to look for what the next Renaissance could be. And the fact that there was something that came after progressivism, and that the best term for it so far is probably the integral worldview. I knew right away that that's what I had been looking for, and that's sort of my home. So I was invited to join the Integral Institute. I was part of the art branch, and then I was part of the business branch, and I worked with Ken Wilbur and other folks in the Institute for a couple of years. But then I realized that I had an independent contribution to make to this, and bowed out on good terms with Wilbur in 2002, started writing my first book, which came out in 2007. So I've been working in this field, trying to make a contribution, try to participate in the unfolding that this promised. And it was around 2012 that myself and a variety of my close friends and colleagues decided that if this worldview really was to gain traction in history, it needed institutions, right? We looked at the emergence of modernity or orange, in the Enlightenment, and the emergence of green, in the 60s. And we saw, okay, let's take lessons from those periods of emergence. We may not be able to socially engineer such a thing, but we can perhaps what you might call garden for emergence, right? Try to create prolific conditions that might help in the emergence of this next great phase of human history. The logic was sort of simple, right? In the sense that modernity emerged from thousands of years of traditional religious civilization. And then over the last 60 years, we've seen the emergence of progressive postmodernism. Progressivism is certainly not the end of history. Something comes after it. So what comes after it is bound to look something like we conceive of integral at this point. And part of the way that I really come to I really have conclusion has been solidified despite, setbacks and the fact that it's still, much of this thinking still languishes in obscurity in a larger culture. It really began to appear to myself and the rest of the colleagues in our organization, our Institute for Cultural Evolution, which is now became a 501c3 nonprofit in 2013. So it's just past its 10-year anniversary. We figured that we saw other boutique think tanks having an outsized impact on, for example, the public support for climate change. And we thought, well, if these conservative right-wing think tanks could have such a major effect on public opinion, then we can have an integral effect. And our focus, we started out by working on climate change with the idea that we could see something new and say something more, because we could see how climate change, the issue as a political issue, had become a kind of captive of the progressive postmodern worldview, and that much of the resistance that people were exhibiting toward it was not so much, resistance to a healthy planet. A lot of the resistance was to fear and loathing of progressive postmodernism and its ongoing, dissolution of some of the best that had come before. So the pattern in history, one of the master patterns of evolution that you can see at every level of development, is this process of dialectical development, right? Which has been kind of probably overly popularized, but you're probably familiar with the terms thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The process of differentiation and then integration. Or another way of talking about it is the process of transcendence and inclusion, right? There's many different ways of describing this process, but it is fairly universal. I mean, it's not as if this is an iron law that governs all evolution, but it clearly can be seen, in the technique of sexual reproduction in biology and in the way worldviews emerge in the timeline of history. So this dialectical understanding of evolutionary development really began to illuminate how the green worldview, the progressive postmodern worldview, has gained traction in history by pushing off against both modernism, right? It's negative externalities, environmental destruction, gross inequality, all kinds of systemic bigotry. Modernity has brought a lot of good to the world, and we're pro the upside of modernism. And we're also pro the upside of traditionalism. That is, as I'll explain in a minute when I get into my slides, we're trying to transcend, and include the best and transcend the worst of every one of these worldviews, including the progressive postmodernism. But we can see that much of the energy, much of the traction that Green was able to use to become a major segment of American culture stemmed from the negative externalities of the establishment, right? The kind of cultural truce that existed in the 60s and into the 70s between traditionalism and modernity, sort of the establishment. And progressivism was very much a counterculture, very much anti-establishment. And because many idealistic and smart people could see that modernity was not sustainable environmentally, or it lacked a sense of cultural transcendence, it had all kinds of, it wasn't the end of history. So that this attempt to go beyond it, to reject it, to define a new culture, really exhibits this pattern of antithesis, right? So the thesis is the establishment, the antithesis is the counterculture. And over the decades since the 60s, progressive postmodernism has matured. Now it represents a cultural center of gravity for a gigantic portion of America's elite. It's captured many institutions, including the cultural institutions, media institutions, academic institutions. And there's been some good that's come from that. And we're beginning to see some pathologies that are accompanying that. So when we talk about the synthesis school, or as I'm about to, the idea is to think of what comes next, this next great stage of human history, which is in some ways post-progressive. It's not anti-progressive, but it tries to transcend and include progressivism, and I'll talk about that a little bit more too. But the idea is that the natural opportunity for evolution is to take all of the important sensitivities and inclusive ambitions of progressive postmodern. It wants to include those who've been left behind, and include, the victims, and include the environment, and broaden our concern, right? And I think that's a beautiful and very important evolutionary achievement of progressive postmodernism. But the next step is to include even more, to be even more inclusive, right? To include diversity of viewpoint and not just diversity of skin color, and to, in a sense, revalorize or reclaim the necessity of both modernist values, the best of modernity, and even traditional values too, right? So I'll explain our method for doing that, or how we approach it. But I'm going to take you through a few slides quickly, and we'll do a breakout, and I hope we can have a robust group discussion. But I want to show you the slides, and I'm going to basically talk about our approach at the Institute for Cultural Evolution. I'll say, show a few brief slides about our journey over the past 10 years. And then I'll get into some of the wonky details of this synthesis school to talk about some of the philosophical propositions that we've come to that we feel make a healthy addition to integral philosophy overall. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you see these slides? Okay. So there's many ways to simplify integral thinking, or the integral approach to consciousness and culture. But if we were going to boil it down to words, we might say consciousness evolves, right? That while that's obvious in some ways, this is not something that the larger cultures really appreciated or looked at very closely. And if we wanted to be a little bit more specific, we could say consciousness and culture co-evolve. And that's why we called our institute the Institute for Cultural Evolution. And as you can see here, I have this graphic: the physiosphere, the biosphere, and the noosphere, or matter, life, and mind. These are levels of evolutionary development, and they're building on each other. That's sort of the way evolution overall builds on the best of what's come before. It takes up and uses these previous accomplishments. This is something that also applies within the realm of noosphere evolution, in the sense that it's the accomplishments of the traditional religious worldview that create the civilizing environment that allows modernity to emerge and bring the gifts of liberty and prosperity, which are the fruits of modernity. Where you have a dysfunctional traditional culture, modernity keeps collapsing back into corruption and all kinds of other problems. So the major accomplishments of traditionalism are, even though modernity pushes off against it dialectically, it also includes it, it relies upon it. And you could say the same thing about the way progressive postmodernism relies on the achievements of modernity. If we didn't have a free society with rule of law and freedom of speech and the relative prosperity to pursue these social justice initiatives, in other words, if modernity collapsed, progressive postmodernism wouldn't last long if this evolutionary way of thinking about things is right. So the long-term goals of the Institute for Cultural Evolution think tank, and we call it a think tank because it's something the media can understand, but it's really, maybe a better term for it would be an advocacy organization, right? We're advocating for a developmental perspective or an integral perspective. Our long-term goal is to advance the evolution of culture and politics in America, and our slogan there is "Help America grow into a better version of itself." Our near-term goal is to advance this developmental perspective in the marketplace of ideas, or put this way of thinking on the map, right? Have it be something that pundits are talking about and aware of, because there's really a lack of the power of how seeing things in motion culturally really does illuminate a lot of problems. And indeed, we could say that almost every human problem is at least partially a problem of consciousness. And so the idea that we could gently persuade or facilitate the evolution of consciousness creates a powerful method for solving all kinds of social problems. A simplified expression of our theory of change is that culture and consciousness co-evolve as people expand the scope of what they can value. So we're not so much trying to change people's values as to persuade them into valuing more, right? To valuing other worldviews and not just seeing them for their negatives. And this idea that evolution occurs through the increase in value echoes Alfred North Whitehead's definition of evolution itself, which was kind of a consciousness-centric definition, which he said that evolution is an increase in the capacity to experience what's intrinsically valuable. And I really love that definition of evolution because it goes to the heart of what's really going on. In terms of our approach to advancing cultural evolution, we really have three essential methods, right? One is to improve and develop each major worldview, traditional, modern, progressive, and integral, in accordance with their own goals and values, right? So it's not as just the only path to evolution is to transcend these earlier worldviews. Each worldview is continuing to evolve on its own terms. And so traditionalists can become, healthy and smarter traditionalists, modernists, progressives. Again, this is key that it's not just trying to bring people up the spiral. I mean, we're certainly trying to do that, but we're also trying to improve each worldview as it is. And I'll show how we approach that concretely. The second one is to further the ongoing evolution of consciousness along the timeline of history, or encourage development up the spiral from stage to stage. And then the third one is to help bring about the further emergence of this postmodern or integral worldview by promoting values integration as a method and the practice of cultural intelligence, which is basically awareness of your own worldview and sympathy for the worldviews of those you might oppose. In terms of the method, this is a little diagram of what we call the strata of the political landscape. And at the top are elected officials. That's sort of the most visible outer layer of politics. Below that are political parties. And below that are the specific interests and issues like abortion or immigration or healthcare, all of the political issues that are in play now. But below that is this level that we show here at the bottom of the strata, which we call bedrock values. And the reason that we're focusing on values primarily is that a value is something that an intrinsic value, right? Some direct derivative of the beautiful, the true, and the good as framed by these different worldviews. Deep down, that's something that everybody can potentially agree with. So even though there may be no opportunity to forge agreement around particular interests that are highly polarized, the idea is that there's a cultural solution, that hyperpolarization, one of our chief issues, focuses as a think tank. That hyperpolarization is really a cultural problem that's existing upstream from politics, and that the cultural solution that is part of the reason that American politics are so dysfunctional, and the reason that there's so much animosity between the two or three sides, is that there's been significant cultural evolution over the past 50 years with the emergence of progressivism. But that hasn't been evenly distributed, right? Not everyone is progressive by far. And what it's done is it's stretched out the culture so that it's no longer coheres as a governable entity. But the idea that we have become hyperpolarized and politically dysfunctional as a result of growth points to the opportunity that the solution to these problems involves growing further, right? Growing from the antithesis, which rejects the rest, and to a synthesis which better includes the rest, progressivism and modernity and traditionalism. So here's another way that we think about it. So again, there's certainly worldviews before traditionalism, at least according to spiral dynamics, there's three of them. But just to focus on, we're trying to influence the influencers. We're trying to communicate to mainstream thinkers and many people who really could benefit from a developmental perspective. A few months ago, I was on the Glenn Lowry podcast, The Glenn Show, and I talked in great detail with Glenn about this, and it was intriguing to him. It typically takes more than one exposure, right, to persuade people. But in terms of trying to break it down into something that people can understand, we say, okay, there's the American society, for the most part, the majority of the populace that finds their center of gravity within one of these major cultural structures or worldviews, right, which we have been talking about as traditionalism, modernism, and progressivism. But in between traditionalism and progressivism, there's a dialectical separation or a stage emergence. And likewise here between modernity and progressivism, another stage, emergence. And every one of those emergence creates a kind of a permanent dialectical relationship, a hinge in history. And it's part of these dialectical polarities that actually shape and charge the values, right? Progressive values are partially formed by what's wrong or insufficient with modernity. So the conflict is just as important as the values themselves. And so if we take this same model of three worldviews and then we show it across the left-right political spectrum instead of along the timeline of development here, we can see that there's basically four value categories vying within the political landscape. I mean, there's other ways to divide it up, but I think there's good arguments for this, as I make in my 2020 book, Developmental Politics. That is, they're even though, right, these are all Democrats over here for the most part, and independents as well on the left, there's still a strong polarity between progressivism and modernity, right? Between modernist Democrats and progressive Democrats. And you see that playing out all the time in politics. Likewise, the polarity between traditional religious Republicans and more libertarian or fiscally conservative Republicans. There's a polarity there. The polarity between these two, the divided wings of modernity, I show it as being less strong. And for many years, for decades after World War II, when really modernity was the center of gravity for the culture overall, we were less polarized because we were all more modernist, right? But as progressivism emerged and then traditionalism kind of pushed away from kind of broke the truce between modernity and traditionalism, we now have these two outlying communitarian cultural blocks. Eric Weinstein calls them Magistan and Wokistan. Anyway, I tried to take a more sympathetic view of traditionalism and progressivism, but this is something that's not, you don't have to have integral consciousness to see. In 2021, a prominent Atlantic magazine journalist, George Packer, wrote a piece about the four Americas. And he described these exact segments of the political spectrum, and he labeled them real America, free America, smart America, and just America. And it was great to see that these divisions, these polarities, and the different cultures that they form are becoming more evident to the rest of the society, right? I mean, the events of 2020 and 2021 really demonstrated more clearly than ever before to the rest of the society that progressivism is a thing. It's not just the far left or some subcultures, that it's got power, it's got cultural authority. And so just being able to see green, just being able to recognize and compare and contrast, that's a big aha moment, which, even some of our most intelligent thought leaders can't quite see clearly. So anyway, that's we can talk about that, but this is much more text than is meant to be shown on a slide, but I'm just showing it to you so that you can see how we apply polarity theory, and we really take it farther, I think, than has been appreciated before. And we have these polarity charts, and the polarity charts show some of the positive values of traditionalism and some of the negatives, right? Some of the positive values of the sort of right modernism, some of the negatives, and then likewise on the left. And the idea is that that within these polarities, the positives of each are the remedy for the negatives of its companion, right? So that ideally there's a relationship of challenge and support. And while I think it's possible to work the polarities on the right and work the polarities on the left, I think that both these sides need to evolve more before we can really begin to work the polarity between left and right overall. That's certainly something to debate. So just really quickly through these slides, we started in 2013. We knew we wanted to create an institution. Carter Phipps and I, from What is Enlightenment magazine, some of our other colleagues, we founded this think tank. Initially, for the first few years, we wrote white papers and held influential conclaves. Like we had a variety of invitational conclaves to influencers and luminaries at Esalen. And those were really well received. Here you can see Jonathan Haidt talking to Michael Schellenberger. We had a lot of stars at the conclaves. And we also had a couple of other conclaves in Austin, Austin, Texas. And that was also successful. We got some good media for that. But by 2016, even before Trump was elected, we realized that we needed a book, an integral politics book. And initially, John Mackey and Carter Phipps and I decided we were going to write a book like that. And we started working on it. And I was doing a lot of research into political philosophy, and I got a head of steam with it. And then we tried to sell it to a large publisher, and they weren't interested in any kind of political book from us. They wanted a business book. And so the book that we started kind of got channeled into a business book, even though there's 1,000 leadership books published every week. This was relatively successful. I'm proud of it. But as that book was in the works, I went ahead with a political book, and in some ways it was liberating, because instead of trying to write a super accessible book, for a mainstream audience, I could write a more intellectually challenging book and say what I really wanted to say about integral politics. And both those books were published in 2020. The publication of Developmental Politics was really a shot in the arm for the Institute. It brought on several major donors and supporters. Our board of directors grew. We started hiring some staff. We started developing the organization beyond the kind of writing hiatus that we had been in terms of organization building. And now we're in this phase of institutional expansion and have a lot of exciting projects that are going on. Among them is this growing platform of specific political positions. We have 7 of them so far, including homelessness, immigration, abortion, climate change, education. They're all on the Institute for Cultural Evolution website, culturalevolution.org. And our approach is sort of adapted from conscious capitalism, that business practice, that from the beginning has recommended stakeholder integration, right? The idea that a business has investors and employees and managers and suppliers and the community and the environment. All of these folks are stakeholders in the welfare and the success of the business. And the idea is that we want to take all of the interests into account when we're making business decisions. And so applied to politics, we recognize that traditionalism, modernity, and progressivism are each kind of stakeholders in our democracy, right? These sets of values. And that ideally, any political solution that we may suggest needs to incorporate or be conscious in providing a win for progressive values, a win for modernist values, and a win for traditional values. The kind of prototype example is the success of gay marriage, right? Which may not include traditional interests, right? There plenty of traditionalists are still opposed to it, but it included traditional values nonetheless, right? The right to make a family commitment, that was a deeply traditional idea, right? So gay marriage as a proposition, right? Not just gay rights, but gay marriage, integrated values. It integrated bedrock values, progressive values, of course, and modernist liberty values and traditional family values. And so this idea that if you integrate the values, the solutions, the interests become a little bit easier to reconcile. So that's one of our programs, and we continue to work on that, but we've got other more crowd-friendly ones. But let me quickly just kind of go over some of the, what you might call the tenets of this school of philosophy, which is within the larger integral school of philosophy. We certainly are standing on the shoulders of the integral giants like Teilhard and Whitehead and Wilbur and Gebser. But we can also, because we've been working in politics for 10 years, kind of come to realize certain things that has impacted this philosophy and added some elements to it, right? So here you see the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is most traditionally, right, even outside of integral circles, it's represented as a logarithmic spiral or helix growing wider, right? So it's both cyclical and progressive. It keeps returning, but it also gets bigger and higher. And so you can see this pattern in the stages of evolution of consciousness. Okay, so the first tenet that I'll just briefly mention is that, and I think I already did at the beginning, right, is that the next major worldview, the opportunity that it has, right, it's not just like whatever we want it to be, it's like, the pathologies of one worldview really open the door for the next, right? And so the pathologies of progressivism include rejecting the best of what's come before. And this kind of, we could kind of name them. I do name them in detail in some of those polarity charts. But the idea that the progressivism, because it takes this stance of being kind of radical, it's even though it's culturally powerful, it's still politically not as powerful as it's like to be, right? Even though Bernie Sanders is very popular, he couldn't win the nomination, right? And there's part of the reason is that progressivism is still, as Don Beck used to say, green dissolves blue. Progressivism dissolves traditionalism, and we have 30% of the country that still have a center of gravity in traditionalism. If you reject religion and you reject capitalism, you're going to have a hard time gaining a majority political coalition. So we're thinking, all right, that's a pathology, or at least a shortcoming. And this gives us an opportunity as people begin to see that green can't govern by itself, that it doesn't have an appreciation of the whole spiral. That this gives us an opportunity to say, here's what this next worldview can do, which the previous emergent worldview couldn't. And I mentioned this diagram shows the idea that there's this little worldview emerging beyond progressivism here in this timeline of history, and that it reaches up, it grows up by reaching down. You could say that the degree of our transcendence is ultimately measured by the scope of our inclusion. So we're trying to be more broadly inclusive, and that's part of the way that we claim that we are moving in a dialectical direction, transcending, including progressivism. This idea of dialectical development also relates to how value itself, right? Value and values, right? Value as a general proposition of progress and improvement in the universe, and values as the things that people feel are greater than themselves, or that for which they are willing to sacrifice their self-interest, right? So we're beginning to recognize that, that the way values attract consciousness at every level, right? Even amoebas will swim toward the sugar in the glucose gradient, right? They're making a choice for a primitive kind of goodness, which is survival value. All life is striving for survival value, to survive and reproduce. And that's where goodness begins to get traction on consciousness, even at its lowest levels of emergence, and maybe even before. So we're beginning to recognize that the behavior of that, how can we think about it, rather than just static propositions? We're kind of understanding value as a kind of a form of energy in the noosphere, or at least comparable to energy, in the sense that it's something that you metabolize, like you would metabolize nutrition. It's something that, like it even says in the Bible, where there's no vision, the people perish. So the idea that we can begin to recognize certain behaviors, certain physics, if you will, of the behavior of value, and one of the interesting physical behavior, physics-like behaviors of this non-physical thing that we're calling value, is that it coheres in polarities, right? Like liberty and equality, or real and ideal, or subjective and objective. These are interdependent parts of a larger whole. And when we begin to recognize that the value creating capacity of any one of these poles by themselves is dependent upon the challenge and support from its interdependent counterpart, such that if we want to maximize liberty, we have to have an eye toward equality. And if we want to preserve equality, we can't stamp out liberty. So there's I could give a whole talk on polarities and how they're valuable, but just going through the tenets. Another tenet is that this left and right, which we see some version of in almost every human polity, right? It's indestructible. The polarity of left and right, or progressive and conservative, there's many ways to label it, but it continually reappears. And there's been some interesting neurological research that shows that people are born with a predilection to one or the other. It's not hardwired, that as your life circumstances may, much more determinative in where you end up politically. But the idea here is that just like liberty and equality need to work together to achieve their value creating capacity, ideally, a healthy version of the left and a healthy version of the right, not our current right or left in America, but a more evolved version, would recognize the interdependence. And so one of the practices of the think tank that we recommend is that recognizing the interdependence, we're trying to encourage people who have an integral perspective to recognize that that if they're just spun out, if they're highly partisan on the left, then they may not be taking full advantage of all the integral consciousness in its fullness. And that doesn't make you a centrist. I mean, I certainly am a Democrat. I have a preference for the left side of things, but I also recognize that there's very important propositions that are traditionally associated with conservatism that are necessary. And so one way of thinking about this is if we factor down the polarity of left and right to its most basic elements, one way we might describe it as an orientation toward fixing what's wrong or an orientation to preserving what's right. And the idea here is that either one of these poles, pursued to its maximum with full exclusion of the other, can lead to pathology, right? So if you're only interested in fixing what's wrong and you have no concern for what's been achieved so far, you naturally want to burn it down, start from the beginning. That, of course, means we have to make all the same mistakes again. But if you just emphasize preserve what's right and resist any attempts to fix what's wrong, then you end up reifying the status quo. And the stagnation ultimately means regression. So we want to, like evolution at every level, we want to take up and use the accomplishments of what came before, but we want to transcend it with a larger whole. And that's how this political polarity can be understood as kind of two legs of our progress, or offense and defense, right, on a football team. Another one we can talk about if you like, and that is because spiral dynamics, because both Clare Graves is very much a psychologist. He did his research on his students, and even though spiral dynamics claims to be biopsychosocial, in practice, the majority emphasis, at least in my experience, has been on people's psychological growth, which is not a bad thing, but people talk about what level of consciousness you've developed into, et cetera. And you can also see that within integral circles. And we kind of are beginning to see how that's created part of the problem for integral being more popular and being taken up. Because the focus on psychology inevitably means that there's a hierarchy of people, right? That people in integral are more evolved than people who are traditional. And there are some people who have a traditional center of gravity in terms of their values, but have PhDs and are, completely brilliant geniuses. It's hard to say that, just an average person at progressivism is more evolved. And so what we do is we focus on the structures of history, right? Our emphasis is on cultural evolution. And the idea here is that there's far more solid evidence for the traditional religious civilization, the emergence of modernity, now progressivism. I mean, you can see the evidence for this in the World Values Survey, which is a pretty empirical piece of social science. And so what we're saying is that these are types of culture, and that people can identify with them completely and personify them exactly, or people can use different types of consciousness, right? As Beck said, these are types of consciousness within people, types of cultural consciousness, and they're living structures, intersubjective systems of values, which people metabolize, which helps gives them their identity and their sense of direction. So we're focusing on history more than psychology, although we certainly affirm that what we're talking about is biopsychosocial.
Steve, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, I'm almost done with the slides, but go ahead.
I know you've written a lot on polarities.
Mm-hmm.
Is it fair to say, given the discussion you just had, that the individual progresses when they can hold polarities, but groups get polarized and get stuck when polarities are emphasized?
That's certainly, I would agree with that. I think that that being able to hold two things at once is something that most of these worldviews, most of the kind of cultural agreement structures of these worldviews, when they emerge, when they're fresh, even though they're rejecting what came before, there's a way in which many of them are taking the accomplishments of the previous worldview for granted, right? In other words, modernity is not questioned. And I mean, it's rejected, but there's a way in which you can't help but hold the two. But as these cultures become more established and more insular, when you begin to see these bubbles where people are especially with social media in their bubble, then you begin to see fundamentalisms, right? Traditional fundamentalism, everybody knows about that, right? But we also see modernist fundamentalism, right? In both market fundamentalism and then, strict materialism metaphysically. And then within progressivism, we've now witnessed some strong fundamentalism and cancel culture. It's like they're policing the boundaries. You know, they're trying to create, you know, the pure in group and then the bad other out group, and that, of course, is part of the difficulty. So certainly, the ability to recognize and integrate and hold two truths at the same time, well, that may sound fairly obvious, and it's certainly not, you know, it's not original to an integral discourse, but it's a lot harder than people might think. There isn't a social norm in our society for the benefits of doing that. You certainly don't see it in the media, and so that's a great way to simplify it, Tom. I you know, appreciate that. The last tenet that I'll mention is my coming to appreciate virtues as a practice, as a form of ethics, as a spiritual orientation. This is an ancient approach to ethics. It goes beyond ethics. And I have a chapter in developmental politics where I talk about the history of virtue thinking, virtue theory, and how it's really gained a lot of popularity academically, you know, within social science circles. And we have an exercise online where you create a portrait of your virtues and you get suggestions for how to practice that approach. So I'll, you know, won't go into a description of virtue practice, but I just want to mention it as something that is one of the tenets of the synthesis school that we really emphasize. And so just in conclusion, what do we expect to accomplish in 15 years as a think tank? I mean, the fact that we've got a fairly robust organization with a sustainable budget and, you know, some big supporters, that's quite a bit. You know, we have some middling influence, but we certainly want to have more. So our highest goal is to create greater political solidarity and social harmony in America. And not everybody has to move into this integral stage of culture for that to happen, right? Integral, just in the same way that environmental thinking has trickled down, you know, to modernity and traditionalism to a certain extent. Integral thinking can likewise permeate the culture from above. And one of the ways that we frame that is cultural intelligence, you know, like emotional intelligence. Cultural intelligence is the ability to recognize that these worldviews that are your opponents have positive values that are interdependent with your own values. And, you know, there's more to it than that, but that's one of the variety of different tropes that we have for a proposition of popularization. We want to see many examples of win-win-win legislation and an appreciation of this approach to solving political problems. We would like to see numerous elected representatives informed by a developmental political perspective or philosophy. And we'd like to create a well-established think tank with national influence and international credibility. So just to conclude, let me read my little poem, or maybe it's just an admonition. Let's take care of our country in our hour of need. Let's advance a politics of mutual respect in which everyone of good faith is welcome. Let's renew our nation's political life through a new era of cooperation and kindness. Let's cherish our liberties and defend our nation's integrity. And let's affirm that our winding way to a more evolved culture is a journey worth making. So thanks for that. So I think now is the time we do the breakout group. Do you want me to go ahead and give the prompt for that? Okay. So our kind hosts are gonna put you all in breakout groups. And what I'd like you to discuss, I guess, for 15 minutes or so is how have your own political views evolved since you started practicing integral consciousness? Look forward to seeing you when you get back.
Breakout sessions are not recorded.
Right. Well, just to let people know where we are, we'll have questions and answers, maybe commenting on how things went in your breakout room until quarter till the hour. And then we'll have a second 10-minute breakout groups with different pairings. So we'd like to know who has questions. Just raise your hand and or write your question into chat. Yeah, all right. Jonathan Logan.
Yeah, I had a question based upon something that Steve said early on that relates to the political sort of drift and shift and infighting that happens. So it goes like this: because the emergent is the antithesis of the prior level, as it were, is there a sense that it starts out reactionary? Is there a possibility then that it starts out reactionary and generates shadow at first because it becomes so formalistic about and so politically correct, if you will, about its own ideology, and in doing so, does that create that tension that helps people see which camp they're in and create more identity so that they can formalize themselves?
Yeah, excellent question. I would say that when we're thinking about this dialectical pattern, right, of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, a lot of it comes from the idealist philosophers, Fichte and Hegel. And Hegel never talked about it, or maybe once, but he used different phrases for this process. He called it an affirmation, and then a negation, and then a negation of the negation. Right, so that the synthesis was understood as a negation of the negation, not a complete invalidation of the original negation, but a moderating of it so that the thesis could be re-included, right? So this process, you can see it, rather than thinking about it as a discrete stepwise process when you get into each one of these emergent worldviews and their trajectory of historical emergence and development, is that it's kind of self-similar in the sense you can see all three going on in each stage, right? So, it's kind of messy and not mechanical, but certainly each new stage emerges in history because the problems of the previous stage become so acute that they've got to find a way out, right? You can see this even, in the lower down, if you're familiar with spiral dynamics, that is, the tribal consciousness, the purple meme, that the red warrior consciousness kind of breaks out of that because it doesn't change for thousands of years, and then warfare is always a threat, and so red emerges as a kind of a defense or a way of protecting themselves. And then, of course, red creates chaos of warring tribes, and the traditional religious worldview, the blue worldview, emerges because it can't, it wants law and order, it wants social cohesion, it wants safety and peace. And even though it brings its own kind of war, and it doesn't solve those problems completely, it's very much a great way of putting it is the devil, the god of one stage becomes the devil of the next. Right. So they build a church right on top of the pagan temple. Right. And then, the skyscrapers come to replace the church. And then, progress, right, the modernist god becomes the devil of progressivism, right, because they're rejecting it. So very much there's an antithesis that's pushing off. But at the same time, part of, there's a push and a pull, right? The pull is the opportunity for this new synthesis. I mean, so green is a synthesis of the transcendence that came before. I mean, maybe vaguely. We don't want to try to force fit the facts of history into our theory, but we can see this general pattern. And so I would say that at the beginning, there's both the pull of the potential for a new phase of values, which can be like a synthesis, but there's also an aversion to what came before, and that's this kind of moment of antithesis or this sense of rejection or pushing off. And so, that's part of what's happening with the emergence of the integral worldview. At first, many of us were very drawn to it because it was something other than green, right? That there were elements of green that we were kind of sick of or disappointed with. And it reclaimed a lot of the things that green lost, a lot, modernist rationality, right? Intellectual rigor, right? Empirical concern, right? It's not as if those are completely absent in progressivism, but they certainly are, the truth is somewhat attenuated, right? Or bracketed so that other progress can be made, right? For good reason. But then we say, okay, we've gone as far as we can go, or we see we're being called by this new phase of history, and both we're in antithesis to progressivism in the sense that we're pushing off against it, but we don't have the same luxury as the previous stages, what they used to call, or I guess it's sometimes called first tier. I hate that phrase, but the first tier, they can reject, at least at the beginning, they can fully reject what came before, right? So progressivism can reject modernity, right? Turn on, tune in, drop out, right? Modernism can reject religion, right? Like in the French Revolution, they wanted to strangle all the priests, right? So the antithesis can be intense, and when you don't know better, then you can have the luxury of just vilifying what came before. But we don't have that luxury because we can appreciate the structure of emergence and evolution and recognize that these things are interdependent, and the degree of our transcendence is measured by the scope of our inclusion. So while we have to push off against green to a degree and say we're not just in a seamless continuum, this isn't just mature progressivism. There's a dialectical separation. And so there's that antithesis energy, or we're trying to negate the negation, or a better way to put it is we reject the rejection. We reject the rejection of modernity and traditionalism. And of course, but then we also, as integralists, knowing that our essential, the leitmotif of our whole worldview is synthesis, transcending and including. And so, we're still working that out, right? That's still something that's this interplay between those who are, who have never really quite have escaped the full gravity of progressivism, and that's fine. People have a right to be who they are. And if they like integral theory, but they still have a postmodern center of gravity, so be it. It's probably what you'd expect. Like, we couldn't expect anything else. But there are many of us who feel like, well, no, that's part of the reason that Jordan Peterson was so popular, not that he's an integralist, is that he was sort of really pushing off against the pathologies of progressivism, right? It's latent tyranny. But then, of course, he was, pulled into by the gravity of the right and has now become, pretty strongly right wing. So, that's part of the reason that the intellectual dark web didn't succeed as an anti-progressive intellectual community in any kind of strong way. But that's a whole other discussion, and I've already said a mouthful. Anything else I can clarify regarding your question? Okay.
So Steve, we have another question in the chat, and if you want me to read to you, I'm curious as to whether you or the Institute is in touch with Andrew Yang and his Forward Party.
Well, certainly, one of the members of our Zoom group, the Developmental Alliance, which is meeting next Wednesday, she's been a politician in Southern California, and she's friends with the woman, I'm sorry, I forget her name, who just became the executive director of the Forward Party. She used to be a Republican, and we are actively working to, so she shared some of our work with the Forward Party director, and she was quite interested, but, she's trying to build a coalition. So, it's not as if she's ready to become an integralist, but she's, open to what we're about. The way these political organizations work is it's a little tough to say, hey, pay attention to us. We can't, we'd like to collaborate with them, but the way that the prestige economy unfortunately works is you've got to demonstrate your credibility and your impact in other places, and then you start getting noticed. So my talk with Glenn Lowry was a good mainstream introduction to integral thinking, and that opened some doors and made some connections. But so far, we don't have a strong connection to the Forward Party, but we certainly appreciate what they're doing and would love to be more affiliated.
So one more, and I'd love to hear your take on this, Steve, is Eloy mentions, can we look at integrally why there's been so much tension between spiral dynamics and integral theory?
Sure. I'm willing to, it's inside ball. I'm not really in either camp. And I think a lot of it comes down to both Ken Wilber and Don Beck, right? So back in the 2000, Ken thoroughly adopted spiral dynamics and kind of reoriented his theory around it. The book, Theory of Everything, was very much an endorsement of spiral dynamics. And I had been reading spiral dynamics in 1999. Barbara Marx Hubbard turned me onto the book, right? So I had read that book and was really on fire with it. And then a few months later, a friend of mine shared the pre-publication galleys copies of A Theory of Everything with me. And I saw that Wilber had recognized the power of spiral dynamics as well. And that's when I thought, wow, this is really taking off. That was a sort of a significant moment in the emergence of 21st century integral. And so Don Beck came to Boulder. I went to his workshop, and then I was invited to join the Integral Institute based on my participation there. And at the time, there were a lot of developmental psychologists who were very interested in Wilber and his work and the Integral Institute. It was taking off, and they were all kind of in a sense, vying to be Wilbur's favorite developmental psychologist. And Don Beck won that competition because spiral dynamics was so popular based on the genius of Graves, right? And so then Don started calling what he was doing, I guess it was spiral dynamics integral, right? And so there was this honeymoon between about 2000 and I'm not sure, I bowed out of the Integral Institute in 2002, like I said, but sometime around mid-decade, there was a falling out between Don and Ken, and there was some lawsuits, and there was some animosity, and there was a sense, there was also a split between Don and his co-author, Christopher Cowan. And Cowan was, Karen was very green, and he was very unhappy with the integral move of spiral dynamics. Beck went with it, but Cowan rejected it, and that contributed to their split. So there was all kinds of, I think it's fair to say, ego dynamics. And I think that Don ultimately felt that Ken appropriated his theory and didn't give him adequate credit. And I think Ken thought that that spiral dynamics was too limited. It was a single line of development, a linear line, and he wanted to investigate all kinds of different lines. And so he had a critique of Graves, and there's more inside gossip, but I'm not going to go beyond that.
I had a question in a different direction. I admit I took screenshots as you went along, and I noticed as far as the synthesis or thesis antithesis was I was looking at the practice of character virtues, and I was looking at the ones that you put up there. Faith and prudence and temperament. It's demonstrating to me that those are characters that show up on your graphic, that they sound like not character traits I really am motivated to espouse. I've got sort of an allergy to them, so it's pointing out to me. But there are good points to them, and so it's just.
Sure, I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah.
Let me just kind of jump.
I don't have a clear question. It's like, wow.
Yeah. No, it's good. That's perfect, because actually this exercise, your portrait of the good, this online, character development exercise, allows you to choose from 50 different virtues, right? The virtues which you think are, the fulfill your obligation to something greater than yourself, fulfill your self-interest the best you can be, fulfill your obligation ethically to others. So there's nothing sacrosanct about those particular 7 in the graphic. However, those are the 7 that are included in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and they come from Thomas Aquinas, and they're kind of a meeting of Athens and Jerusalem, and they have a gigantic history. And Martin Seligman, who's the founder of positive psychology, in 2004, he came out with a book called Positive Character Traits and Virtues. And he did this huge social science experiment, thoroughly secular. Seligman is an atheist, but he nevertheless recognized that these 7 fundamental virtues, as I talk about their history in the book Developmental Politics, actually name something that's cross-cultural and universal. And so he doesn't use faith and hope, he uses the word transcendence to talk about those virtues. But those same categories, those classical categories, are validated by social science and found to be developed in a living anthropological context, to the extent that there's something very deep and affirmed about that. And again, in all the modern philosophers in virtue ethics, like Alistair McIntosh, and many of the prominent academics who are virtue philosophers, have paid tribute to the genius of those classical 7. But you can certainly substitute other words, and that's what that exercise is about. But thanks for noticing that.
Go ahead, Larry, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, I put this question in the chat. Steve, are you familiar with, as an integralist, been preoccupied the last few years, especially since Trump, with seeing both sides of the political spectrum, Democrats, Republicans, generally speaking. and seeing the benefits of both sides, and not just being a Democrat or just being a Republican. I voted Democrat 95% of my life. But I opened up much more to what the Republicans are saying about various things. So off of that, my question was, are you familiar with the No Labels group in Congress? These are members who are both Republicans and Democrats, and they're working together on issues in the event, and they're trying to put forth candidates for 24. And one advantage is they don't have the spoiler effect of a third party. So they're actually trying to forward some, or well, shouldn't use that term, actually
They're trying to forward,
generate a Democrat, a politician that will be either Republican or Democrat, but they kind of walk the middle. They're more centrist, probably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're very familiar with No Labels and applaud their work. We've been in touch with them. We asked them to send a representative to one of our Esalen conclaves. You know, we're not really on their radar screen just because we haven't had a big enough impact yet. Also, they're very much inside the Beltway. You know, the kind of Washington, D.C. is their focus, and that's their strength, is that they have all these political connections, and they're very much, you know, creatures of D.C. And so centrism is often the best approach, and many of our issue positions kind of start with a centrist orientation. So, for example, our position on immigration and our position on I guess it was healthcare, was derived from a book that No Labels published in 2020, a guide to the election, and they had specific issue positions that kind of laid out a potential solution or an approach to those problems. Now, I also have written academic paper. My latest one in an Integral Review Journal was called "Why Centrism Fails," and part of the reason it fails, at least in this politics of culture that we're working on, is that it's essentially modernist, right? So, you know, the center of the political spectrum, as I showed, is very much modernist. And while modernism is still strong and we validate many of its important, you know, contributions, from a cultural perspective, there's not a lot of juice there. There's not a lot of passion, or I mean, they got plenty of beef, but no juice, right? So I think that the part of the reason that centrism is no longer as powerful as it once was, despite the good work of organizations like No Labels, is that modernity is in the process of being transcended by progressive postmodernism, and many of the most educated, most privileged, smartest, you know, the good people in the clerisy of America are attracted to progressivism because from their perspective, it offers a sense of moral transcendence that modernity lacks. So for cultural reasons, they're just not going to be able to generate the kind of political identification that you really need in politics today that we saw Trump be able to do in spades, right? So anyway, you know, just like the Forward Party, another kind of a centrist political endeavor with excellent, you know, intentions and good support. We are fans of No Labels and wish them well. But again, you know, it's not as if we're going to persuade them to adopt an integral perspective until we can make a bigger impact in other venues in the culture.
Yeah, and I would add, Steve, that an integralist perspective on politics is not a centrist position.
Exactly.
At least it's not for me.
Right.
And I can truly see some of the benefits of both sides. And to have a thriving, healthy democracy, we need those both sides. If it goes too much one way or the other, democracy suffers for it. I mean, we have all these cancel dynamics and cultures that are about shutting the other side down, which is not democracy.
Yeah. Well, one of the premises, like for example,
I can still hear you.
Yeah, John Avlon, he was one of the founders of the Daily Beast, and he's kind of a New York media guy. He's a prominent centrist, and he's expressed the view of many centrists that we have to cut off the wing nuts, he calls it. That was the title of his book, I think. That you know, that both traditionalism and progressivism are the crazies. David Brooks has advocated something similar. And that we just need to kind of circle the wagons of modernity where we can agree. And like I showed in that polarity chart, there's not a strong polarity because they're all in the same worldview within modernity, even though they have a right and a left. But, you know, not everybody in green is a wingnut. They're the most evolved form of large-scale culture that's yet to appear on the timeline of history. So if you want to try to cut them off good luck trying to evolve your politics.
At least the
Same with
healthy aspect
traditionalism,
of green.
right?
Yeah,
We
at
may
least the
see,
healthy aspect of green, yeah.
yeah, we may see all kinds of craziness within traditionalism as well. But these are foundations of Western civilization and very important values. The virtues practice I mentioned, very much a traditional level practice, which can rise up like any line of development and be, have an integral expression. So again, I'm not a centrist. I don't advocate centrism, but we're certainly centrist friendly. And we think that to the extent that they can gain traction, we applaud their work, but we're not limited in the recommendations that we make to centrist sensibilities.
Understood. Yep. And I would offer a challenge of sorts to this group, SDI, that if you see yourself as an integralist, question why you're just a Democrat or just a Republican. I think most people here consider themselves Democrats. As an integralist, you need to be seeing both sides, because as an integralist, we're willing to include the earlier stages, but why not include laterally both political parties or 3-4 political parties, whatever?
Sure. Well, especially since these earlier stages are mostly on the right and the more recently appearing stages are mostly on the left, you would expect that. And that's, I think, inevitable and perhaps healthy in many circumstances. But the synthesis literally has to synthesize, viewpoint diversity, which means it needs to recognize that although the current left and the current right may be, too crazy to integrate, the underlying principles of preserve what's right and fix what's wrong that animate the core of both the telos of both sides, that can be integrated within your own perspective, with your own political opinions. And that indeed is a practice in its own right.
Right. Christine/Tom, you're next.
Oh, thank you for your presentation, Steve. Enjoy your talk. Can you say what makes you most hopeful at this point? I don't want you to say the things because you've already given us a lot of information that is hopeful. But for you personally, what makes you the most hopeful?
Well, I could come at that from a variety of angles. That's an excellent question. I appreciate you asking it. My hope is based on my deep conviction to the idea that all things work together for good in the long run, that we live in a universe of purpose and progress, that although certainly regression is always a possibility, I don't take it for granted, but we can see that since the Big Bang, we've made some progress. And while we may have to take a step back before we can step forward, I don't think that's inevitable. And so I have hope in innovation. I have hope in the natural impulse for improvement. The evolutionary impulse, as it's sometimes called. I have hope in the beautiful, the true, and the good as being lights that are guiding our civilization, even if we don't always get it right. So, another way of talking about hope is a polarity I didn't mention, another indestructible, permanent, recurring, interdependent polarity, which is particularly relevant to politics, and that is grievance and gratitude. Right. So in politics, grievance, calling for things to be better, that can create change. It can create value. Right. That's much of the good that's occurred over the past few decades have occurred by people being militant about their grievances. Right. But if this polarity theory is right, and the value creating capacity of political grievance is interdependent with its polar counterpart, then we'd have to say that that's gratitude. Right. To preserve what's right. And so ultimately, part of the reason that we can see that all the political goals of progressivism have not been achieved at the rapidity that they perhaps like is that there's no gratitude in sight, right? It's all grievance. It's all very much, they're angry and they're militant. And, again, there's good reasons for that, but their own strategy, their own tactics would be more effective if they could understand this principle and appreciate that a certain amount of gratitude for the fact that we live in a free society where, if you try to protest in China, they put you in jail, right? I mean, there's some elements of what came before that we need to have gratitude for if our grievances are going to be effective. Because otherwise, if your grievance looks to those who you would try to persuade as just another attempt to burn it all down, if you just think that America is irredeemable, then your ability to create democratic progress is going to be severely hampered. So I have hope in gratitude, and I have hope in the fact that people are not satisfied with the status quo, and the evolutionary impulse compels us to try to make things better.
And Charlie, do you want to unmute yourself? And what's your question? Actually, I just unmuted you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was trying to find the button. Yeah, so I'm not, I've been meditating for many years and doing mindfulness practices. I didn't know what integral was, but I figured I'd join it because when I read the blurb, it sounded, interesting to me. This is only my second meeting. And so I had to Google some words that you guys used tonight, but I'll say what I would challenge what's being said with is we have a very dysfunctional government on both sides. And so coming to a centrist place assumes that there is a place that is reasonable. And so I think in kind of coming from this space of, really working on my own, mindfulness practices and trying to go within, I realize I have to pull away from a lot of the things that, it almost creates some friction with some of the, the culture that we live within. And I would say that I don't think that this system is healthy on either side. And so I think that coming from that space, it's not about burning it all down. I think we have to come to a space where we as individuals actually connect with one another, and the ultimate core desire of us all to be, healthy, happy, secure, have the ability to self-actuate and the ability to, have our needs met. And this culture is not providing that. And I think there are a lot of things. We have sacrifice zones here. We have, it's almost fantastical to believe that we are living in a world where, everything assumes that it's, that there is some balance to be had between the two sides when we're looking at a corporatocracy who literally is exploitative on every level. And so we have kids who aren't getting what they need in school. We have homeless children going to bed hungry. We have, sacrifice zones all over this world, are all over this nation. We have, food deserts. We have,
Sure, there's many problems. No need to list them all.
Right. No, but I'm just getting into the point that I guess my point is, and I'm sorry if that was irritating, but my point was just that I think it's really important for us to come to a reasonable space of like, we all really want similar things. We all want our needs met. And so coming from that space and not, I'm going to try and, find some good in a side that, or choose a side when there really isn't a side to be had. I think we are humans. We're supposed to be working together. And I think, obviously large corporations would want us to be segregated into these sides.
Okay, well, I appreciate your comment. I mean, what I said earlier about centrism, another way to think about it right now in this age of strong polarity, if you ever played with a magnet and tried to find the center of a magnet, kind of throws you to one side or the other because there's really no stable place in between the poles. I think we're seeing a lot of that going on right now in our current culture, which is part of the slogan that we have is that there's very little common ground left to be found, although certainly bipartisan compromise is good where you can get it. But we're trying to stake out higher ground, a synthesis, a new cultural agreement space where people recognize that that although there's political division, we're ultimately all one people. And it's not just a kumbaya moment. I mean, there's some philosophical underpinnings for what the practice of that is. But, I agree. We're human, and we have to find a way to be human together as a human family. Okay, next question.
Go ahead, Eric.
Great, thanks, Kathy. Hi, Steve. So I have a question. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in education, and for me, I'm coming into academia in an extremely turbulent time right now. Never mind what the pandemic has done, but even the value systems generationally that were conflicted. My question for you is regarding this as a philosophy, and to me, it harkens back to the days of Plato, where the role of an academia is to really hash out ideas of what's pertinent to the time that people are living in. So my question to you is, I hear the word institute a lot, and to me, it seems like a lot of this philosophy really, at least not to my knowledge, there may be, it's just not what I know of. There may not be a space that really allows this philosophy to be taught, discussed, criticized in a healthy space of dialectic to sort of provide that example. Like I work with a lot of schools, so I see the pipeline of K through 16 quite often, and I see how that system oftentimes breaks down in many different ways, where integral to me, it's like it's almost trying to bring back the multidisciplinarity of what education is really supposed to be throughout the schooling experience, instead of highly specialized fields for economic and so on at the back end, but really something bigger than that. So my question to you is, with regard to schools of this philosophy, are there things that were tried in the past, they didn't work out for various reasons or challenges? Are there things kind of on the horizon now that, like this Institute of Cultural Evolution, sounds like it might be kind of another wave to try to get this in like an accredited setting? So can you maybe talk a little bit to that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I would say, it's a big question and a big discussion, and the proper answer would be like a 20-minute dialogue between you and me on the subject. But thanks for raising it. I will say that the current state of American higher education is certainly it's kind of racked by progressive postmodernism, kind of capturing many of the more elite institutions. It's not a blanket statement, but Jonathan Haidt's Heterodox Academy, I don't know if you're familiar with that organization, that have tried to gather academics who find themselves in a monoculture of progressivism. And so, again, the idea of heterodox is there's viewpoint diversity, and he's tried to kind of encourage that. And then some schools are more captured by that than others. Some departments within schools are more captured by progressivism than others. And again, it's not all bad, right? That they're trying to reclaim morality. So we have to be sympathetic to it and not just see it as a scourge. But at the same time, that we're seeing a period in history where higher education is in a kind of a crisis. Whether it will emerge out of that or whether there has to be creative destruction, we've yet to see. But think tanks from the beginning, right? The world's oldest think tank is the Brookings Institution. And they were partially created as a supplement to academia to create white papers and position papers for government in ways that academia wasn't fulfilling that intellectual role. And so think tanks have now become an important part of the larger landscape of American intellectual life. And so we're just taking advantage of that we can raise money and we can get media attention and, go under the rubric of this think tank institute. Sure, would I love to create a university, a proper university? Absolutely. But part of the dilemma is that because integral philosophy and the integral perspective is not adequately appreciated in the larger society, that if you get a PhD in integral, there's not a lot you can do with it. I mean, unless you're entrepreneurial like us, and you're willing to go out and create an independent nonprofit. There's not a lot of jobs, right, in academia for integral philosophers, and indeed they would be canceled pretty quickly, right? So they're used in the aughts, in the previous 20 years ago. There were some attempts among mostly in the Bay Area, attempts to some of these alternative schools that used to be progressive schools when mainstream academia was more modernist in the center of gravity. Now, mainstream academia is more progressive than the San Francisco progressives. But it started with the California Institute of Integral Studies, which it's their use of the term integral is not the same as what we would understand it as. They're using it's based on Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga, but there's certainly some overlap. They had a lot of integral practitioners. Alan Combs, probably the leader there, but ultimately it was, very green, right? So that's okay. John F. Kennedy University, another kind of non-prestigious school. I mean, compared to Berkeley and Stanford, but still a legitimate accredited university in the Bay Area. For a number of years, they'd offered a master's degree in integral thinking. But again, you could get a master's degree, it wasn't worth anything because there wasn't any demand for it. And so the economics, there just wasn't enough people signing up for it. And they ultimately canceled the program. So that's been the dilemma for many of these small universities. Again, Meridian universities deserves a mention. They've tried to incorporate integral. But again, if you go there, if you have an integral sensibility, at least my impression, it's still very green. And again, that's nothing wrong with that, but there's a dialectical difference between the two, right? I'll mention one more thing regarding universities, and I don't know whether you followed the emergence of universities that have come out of what is inappropriately called, no longer valid, but so you'll know what I'm talking about, the intellectual dark web, and that is Austin University, right? Not University of Texas, Austin, but Austin University. Many of the luminaries who were in that, space of not being right wing so much, but resisting progressivism, like Jonathan Haidt and Barry Weiss and Glenn Lowry. There's a whole host of these kind of celebrity intellectuals who kind of circled the wagons and joined the effort to create this alternative university. But part of the reason that they were able to succeed and get media attention is that Joe Lonsdale is a very successful young venture capitalist. He's billionaire. He's a libertarian, and he wrote him $100 million check. Right? Nothing gets the media's attention like $100 million check to start your university. And so when we get a $100 million check, that'll get integral on the map, and it'll create demand for integral thinking, and it'll prime the pump so that we can get a true university started. And I'd love to do that. We can see a little bit of that with Ray Kurzweil, right? He started the Singularity Institute, which I think is pretty misguided in terms of their thinking about the singularity. But nevertheless, it was, they were darlings of Silicon Valley and they were popular. And now they've spun that into Singularity University. And I know from insiders that it's highly dysfunctional and political and kind of a nightmare, but they've got millions of dollars. And again, I don't want to sound cynical, but I do think that your position in the prestige economy, the amount of money you can attract, the demand for your graduates, all of these are elements of the necessities for a successful university, and we haven't got there yet. So we're trying to put this way of thinking on the map as a first step.
Can I weigh in on this discussion real quick? When Ken Wilber started writing in his association with transpersonal psychology, he really had to bust out because they were slowing him down and annoying the hell out of him. But that severed the one connection to academia. And we've been flying without it in many ways, without the connection. There is an attempt at IEC now to develop more of an academic track and to try to create that connection, which is tall order. But we're putting people on a committee to really begin to develop that liaison, because we haven't done well on that. We've just gone to the public and we've avoided that important venue.
Sure.
So,
yeah, and a lot of these academics who are attracted to integral, who have integral consciousness, have to kind of be in the closet about it because of the intense cancel culture that they're part of in these universities. So I told Kathy that we would leave room for another breakout group, and we're past the ideal time for that. But let me, at least for 5 or 7 minutes, maybe we could have another breakout group. And the prompt here is, at this moment in history, what do you think are the key areas of society wherein an integral approach can do the most good or create the most cultural evolution, right? We thought politics is an area, which is what, prompted the creation of the Institute for Cultural Evolution. But there's other areas too, and also niched out areas in society. I'd love it if you talk for just a couple minutes among yourselves about where you think the low-hanging fruit is, where integral can really demonstrate its value proposition.
We just have a few closing announcements, and then we invite people to stay after 6 o'clock Pacific time for our sort of after conversation more informally.
okay. So we're getting into the end of our formal time. And I'd like to thank Steve, our presenter, for a wonderful presentation today. And where can people get more information about your work or contact you, Steve?
Sure. Well, the headquarters website for the Institute for Cultural Evolution is culturalevolution.org. And that website extension, Steve at culturalevolution.org is my email. Info at Cultural Evolution is the general email for the Institute. I can also point folks to our political magazine, which is one of the major programs of the Institute called The Developmentalist. And we have a whole bunch of integral articles and videos and other activities and ways to get involved. And that's at developmentalist.org. So those are our two websites, and that's the best way to learn more.
Thank you, Steve. And I see Kathleen has already put in the chat, so you can copy and paste to get it. And
Actually, that didn't work very well. There was a spell check that put a space in the middle that will make it not work. It's better to
Culturalevolution.org. Yeah, all one word.
I think people know how to do that. And I highly recommend Evolution's Purpose. So one of my favorite books. So a couple more quick notes before we go into the informal is IEC 2023 is happening May 23rd to 29th. And I highly encourage you to join myself, Christine, Jerry's going from San Diego Integral, Jerry Golick, and we're going to meet in Budapest and then go out to Lake Balaton and do the tour. The Magical Mystery Tour in the bus is unbelievable. Some of the things we've done.
For people that don't know, IEC is the Integral European Conference.
Yep. 2023, headed by Ben Santana. Quick reminder, visit our website, sandintegral.org for next month's event on May 13th by Karen Voorhees. And do we have a title yet, Karen?
Fun with Eros and Agape. And I'll try to think up a punchy subtitle that defines those terms for people who don't know what they are. But I'm imagining a couple of short presentations, meditations, and then breakout groups, and then harvest what we did in our breakout group. So I'm having fun putting it together anyway.
Oh, this sounds X-rated. I can't wait.
Maybe R.
Fun with Eros, yeah. Where could it go?
Yeah, goes back to Agape.
All right. So RSP, if you want to come to that, remember, we're still taking donations to pay for all our costs. So we're going to move to the informal chat. Feel free to jump in and dialogue. Try to pick up on what other people are saying so that we generate some depth in the conversation. And we can pick right up with, if you want, what is that low-hanging fruit? What are the entry points? If I got that question right. Maybe in your breakout group, something came up good on that. So without further ado, feel free to jump in.
Invite everyone that's leaving.
So who starts this?
Anyone?
All right, I'll jump in. This is a tough one. I've been playing with, as a developmentalist, my own personal, professional enactments of what it is to be integral for a couple decades, maybe 3. And a couple things I've learned. There's not a good answer for Steve's question, in my opinion. The low-hanging fruit, even though it's considered low-hanging fruit, is still pretty high. It's pretty up there. People at green, orange, amber, they don't care about integral concepts, theories, maps, models, territory. They just don't get it. And I think it's a huge mistake to try to teach integral to people that aren't integral, or at least exit green There's a readiness for it. And there's lots of examples of that. Consultants that I've known of who've tried to do integral theory in businesses, integral concepts, integral whatever, they have not succeeded. I think it's a head trip to try to teach integral, unless you're talking to people that are legitimately integral. In other words, at least their cognitive line is moving into integral pretty well, into teal or yellow in spiral dynamics. Yeah, so, and I'm an optimist, but I'm more of a realist, as I've learned to be. Optimism is nice, but reality always trumps it. And so I try to be optimistic about how I deal with reality, but not to get into spiritual bypassing kinds of dynamics that make me poo-poo reality or poo-poo the earlier stages and be all about, oh, I've got the answer. I don't. I think one of the best answers I've discovered, I was sharing this in one of the earlier breakout group with Olav and the others, that not to get caught up in integral theory, not to get caught up in maps and models and the concepts, because that actually gets in the way of really connecting with people. Olav was talking about just being a good person. Yeah, that looks a little bit different at each stage, granted. And to understand that there's a lot of what are called bad actors in the world. They don't want this to work, be it integral or any stage. They just don't want it to work. And it's naive as an integralist to think that, oh, as long as everybody's being integral, no, that's not real. So I don't have a good answer for like, what is the low-hanging fruit? And I look at that as real, that the low-hanging fruit is actually still pretty high. It's pretty inaccessible because, well, it just is what it is. And that's not a bad thing. It just is where it is, at least as I understand it, and I'm open to changing my understanding of all that so I can engage it better. And I'll leave it there.
Can I jump in right there?
Oh my, yeah. My snarky first response off the top of my head to that question was the low-hanging fruit for each one of us is whatever our passion is, where we feel most called. That's where we move into action. But what the reason I jumped in now, Larry, was the substance of what you said resonates very deeply with me right now. I'm really involved in the whole aftermath of the challenge that Nora Bateson tossed, the Molotov cocktail she tossed out about a year and a half ago, challenging, where she said on Facebook, stage theory is BS, always has been, and it's colonial as hell, it's got to go. And, you know, that's really roiling, I have to say in a good way, it's roiling the communities right around Ken Wilber. They are really looking into, I mean, we're not going to toss stage theory. I mean, a lot of you are therapists, you know that we go up, we Piaget, I mean, we're going to toss Piaget? I don't think so. But they are really examining the core issue, which is how we as putative integralists engage with people whose center is in the earlier arising stages. How do we engage them with respect, with dignity for who they are? And this gets to my response to what you were saying, Larry, because I feel very powerfully about this too. There is this kind of very subtle colonialism in the sense that, oh, if we could teach people to be integral, that would help them. No, that is a colonial mindset right there. We are crossing somebody's boundary without them inviting and trying to take over. That's a psychological kind of colonialism. To me, it's, Larry, what my response to what you were saying is the answer. The hard answer is for us to really be it, ourselves. And not try to teach it, not try to impose it, but to be it and act from it and recognize and have the absolute respect for every other human being and every other being. And for where things are going badly with people in whose center of gravity is traditional or modern or postmodern, understand this is where the compassion, the Buddhist virtues of compassion and insight to come in to see what would it take to make me behave like this. That tells me what kind of distress they're in, what can be changed to help them be a healthy version of who they are now. They will go on up the levels or not as it suits them. That's not my business. But what is preventing this person or this part of society from being a healthy version of itself? And then the progression up through the stages will take care of itself. And that is my impassioned answer to your impassioned statement, Larry. I'll put the talking stick down now.
Yeah, thanks,
Way
Karen. What I would add to that was what I talked about in my breakout group actually 15 minutes ago that I wanted to add here, but I just didn't remember. Senior moment. It's not about trying to teach integral to the world. It's more about being integral, embodying it, is what you were saying, Karen. Embodying it, then going into the earlier stages or into with people that are in these earlier stages and being with them away from the compassion and wisdom and whatnot, from the integral perspective, be it teal or turquoise, and engaging them in a way that's healthy, that maybe helps move them a little bit out of entrenchedness, to help them realize that, oh, there's possibility other than just the way I see things, without trying to just shove it down their throats. But try to get them into a state of wonder, maybe, or curiosity, or just, that could be huge in itself. So
yes. And you know, that makes me think of the conference in Boulder 5 years ago, where I met Tom and Christine and some of the others of you for the first time. The one thing that blew my mind more than anything else was Ginny Whitelaw, when she was up on stage at what point, and she was talking about how we engage in when there's a conflict that has to do with us being at a different stage. I forget how she framed it. It was very elegant, but she said, how do you deal with someone in a conflict when they're in coming from a different level? She said, you meet them where they are and you fall in love with them. I fell in love with Ginny Whitelaw when she said that.
So, you know, low-hanging fruit, they don't have to adopt all of integral theory in order to have the experience, the attraction. This is what I said in my breakout group, is if they have this state experience of inclusivity, of the mystery, of the wonder, of the spirituality, of the love, then they move to wanting to name it. And they start looking at the geeky aspect of integral as it attempts to really describe what the experience is. So creating that state experience is always here. I was giving Christina a hard time because two of her friends came down and they're both psychoanalysts. And some of you may know psychoanalysts have to get a PhD or an MD. It's 5 more years of training. But it's a very specific, field of study that's pretty rigid. But her entry point became yoga and meditation. And it began to expand the boundaries. I mean, I asked her today, how has it changed how you do psychoanalysis? She says it's having a profound impact. I said, do you feel free to change the parameters? Because she's a training analyst now, late in her career. She says, absolutely. So it's not going to be an intellectual understanding. The geeky type like us, I liked it intellectually at first. And then the state came, but a lot of people go through the experience first and they go, what was that? And they want more. So I'm a little more optimistic that this is going to catch fire because it doesn't demand loyalty to any one tradition. And then the beauty is every tradition, they seem to arrive at many of the same place, the non-duality, the love. The leaders of the field seem to get there. So I'm a little more optimistic. Pie in the sky.
I'll just jump in. One thing that's popping up for me is just the idea that, Wilbur didn't invent integral consciousness or whatever. He's just describing something that he noticed. And so then, the theories around it of how does it work and everything are, they're helpful or they're interesting. But I think, the point is that it's a natural evolution of humans. That's where we're all, we're all headed in that direction. I mean, that's kind of the theory of it. And that seems to make sense. Like, and again, for me, like what I see happening is that people, like if you look around, I always say that like if you watch the news, you're going to go blow your brains out, but if you turn your head and you look at the people who are trying to do good in the world, who are trying to evolve, who are trying to figure things out, who are trying to help, be helpful, who have the world-centric view, if you turn your head and look there, there's just amazing stuff going on all the time, all these amazing people doing amazing things. And the thing is, like, as we move from one level of cultural development to another one, it's a turbulent time, and we're sitting in that. We're being digested, which isn't that much fun. Like it's hard to be digested. There's a, so I think this is what being in the middle of evolution feels like. And it, and again, you can look this way, you can look that way, you're going to see different things. But I think millions of people are moving into their own area of like expertise or their own area of power, and those people will develop an integral consciousness, whether they've ever heard of integral theory or not, and be addressing things from that world-centric viewpoint eventually, if we don't destroy ourselves first.
I like your comment, Jerry. We're in the middle of the digestion. That's a good one.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to bring up an experience I had with Terry Patton's social experiment, The New Republic of the Heart. And I think that's a good example of integral thought in practice. And we ended up with all kinds of taking action in different areas of inner work and outer work and we space and community building and affiliating with other groups and things like that. It's lost a little momentum with Terry's passing, but it's still going, and it's still, so there's this whole element I think that he brought in and that is the I don't know that he brought it in, but he pointed it out as the element of the sacred and putting a little more emphasis on that deeper value rather than the externalities or the what we can see in the physical world. Yeah, that's it.
I remember at the What Now conference 5 years ago in Boulder, the Ken Wilber conference, at some point in one of the general assemblies, somebody asked how many people here have a regular meditative or spiritual practice. And I would say well over 3/4 of the people in the room raised their hands.
We could ask that here.
You want to ask it, Eloy? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Surprise, surprise. I don't know if people have more comments on low-hanging fruit, but I wanted to ask Steve, I wish he was still here. I wonder if conservatism is undergoing a lot of change right now, because there sure seems to be a lot of momentum within conservatives, some of it dark and self-destructive, that, some of it jettisons some of their traditional values, some of it regressive. But I mean, we're always talking about postmodernism and how much of an influence they're having and what they're undergoing, changing, trying to reach second tier. But it feels like conservatism's in a desperate search to redefine itself.
Yes.
Anyone else feeling that?
Yes, that and the fact that it's got its own gravity too. I mean, it's still pulling people in.
Mhm.
I think the same could be said for the left, honestly.
Mhm. Although I see the right, the conservatives as in more extreme distress as a group. How much distress would I have to be in to choose Donald Trump as my champion for my values? I would have to be in extreme distress. That's the kind of distress. I mean, I try to put myself in that mindset, and I see this is the world I know. The good, the true, the beautiful is crumbling before my eyes, and the only alternative is hell. I mean, the world is going to hell. I and everything I value and everything cultural, everything familial is disappearing. It's vanishing. They are in extreme distress. And I feel like, how can we help them be a healthy, how can we help them? And this is where nonviolent communication, what would it take for them to be safe, to feel safe, to be a healthy version of themselves? I think that if that's what I think an integral understanding where we would need to start. And that's not my low-hanging fruit, that's somebody else's, but I'm kind of scanning the horizon to see somebody who can help here.
If you think about it, Trump has functioned as, and hear this word, he's functioned as a redeemer of sorts for the MAGA crowd. These are people who, generally speaking, who society has repressed, oppressed for decades, pretty much since the advent of postmodernism, and typically referred to as the bigots, the narrow-minded, the rednecks, the whatever. And Trump, in his bombasticness, gave these people permission to speak their minds, to express their emotions. And anybody, to your point, Karen, with compassion, anybody who's been oppressed long enough, and I see this with my little sister, it's really ugly. I supported her in finding Orange. I never talked about it this way, but helping her find her voice, she turned into a monster. I mean, she cut off communication with the rest of us siblings. It's like, so Trump has enabled that. So he's in a sense redeemed them, called them out of their darkness. Not that they're out of their darkness, but at least he's given them permission to express all that they want, and their anger, their bigotry, their closed-mindedness. Not that there's none of this going on the left, because there is. So, yeah.
Yeah, someone had mentioned sacredness, and it may have been you, Eloy, with talking about Terry Patton. And there's something to that. And I have found that my traditional self, and frankly, the more foundational aspects, the body, were largely disowned. And I've had to go in and find a sacred relationship through shadow work and other means, find a deep sacred relationship, and even being able to feel into aspects of traditionalism, really working with Diane Hamilton. I was able to find the deep value and sacredness in these spaces that I had so radically disowned, that I had really othered, even though intellectually through integral languaging, I pretended to own and pretended to have, and it was an honest attempt, but until I reintegrated, and that's still in process, I wasn't able to fully inhabit those spaces with people that have a deep felt sense and a body sense, and that's how they relate, sensing into reality. And that's brought such a richness into my own life. I'm really valuing those spaces more than ever, and I'm not as much in conflict with them as I used to be.
I see Kat has her hand raised. Go ahead, Kat.
Oh, I was just gonna comment on the Trump comments, I guess, is when I was doing a discussion group several years ago one of the things we worked with is, if you can label the different aspects of Trump that you find that you have resistance to do that work of finding them in yourself, even if they're not exactly, I mean, his life is different than my life, right? But characteristically, I can say, where am I lying? Where am I, right? And I think that's like, call it like it is, and then look deeply at myself and own that. And speaking to the sacred, I just have the sense that everything is sacred. So even Trump being in office, he's holding up a mirror for each of us individually. And it's a question of what we choose to do with that. It's not really, to me, it's not really about politics. Politics is just a concept. It's something that's unfolding in reality. But at a very sacred level, he is a human being, just like I'm a human being, and everyone on this call is a human being. And so if I perceive everything as sacred, then I don't hold anything outside of that. I don't care who that is. Not that I want terrible things to happen to anyone. I'm not suggesting that, but I also feel like resistance does not create the best action. So my choices for action coming out of resistance are a completely different quality than acceptance. And so that's just kind of how I was trying to relate to Trump and to other things that were going on. Thank you.
Thanks, Kat. I'll kind of riff on that a little bit. We had some talk about sacredness, and metabolize came up a few times. And I want to just put out a little bit of a different perspective. In the metaphor of the caterpillar becoming the butterfly, we metabolize ourselves, we become digested. And then from that soup, that deconstructed goo, it's almost like there's a reactivation of the sacred stem cell that can become something new. And they organize in a new way and recalibrate into something that can emerge. And the caterpillar destroys life, and the butterfly pollinates. So as I can sometimes look at the world and think it's going to hell. There's also the unpredictable element of the sacred that can, will, and is emerging beyond our will and strategy. Maybe the psychedelic movement that's getting steam, that there's an interest in our recreation giving us glimpses of oneness. That might be part of the healing that's going to bridge the divides. This might not be a common view, but I see in our youth a lot of gender fluidity being an evolutionary birth of something that's never existed before, that's looking at what a integration of polarity since the beginning of the time might look like. So the best I know how to do to faithfully shape the emergence of these imaginal cells as a collective is to stay also true to the expression of my own passion and love and delight and genius and humanity, because it's not always pretty, as best I can, with maybe a faithfulness, and I'm a faithful person, that there's an intelligence. And I think part of the work of Integral is even developing extra senses of this awareness of a sacred participation that we can and will in time develop and become more adept in partnering with. But it's an unknown partnership, it's almost a partnership of faith. So that's a way that I can articulate in this moment the promise of why we're here tonight at all.
Well, it's interesting that psychedelics have come up a few times tonight. Mary put a comment earlier. I was at a workshop this week titled "The Revolution Will Not Be Psychologized," and it was a bunch of therapists, psychedelic therapists, and coaches. And one of the amazing stories in there was that several of the psychologists were were leaving their profession to become coaches because they didn't want to have to risk their clients' privacy with putting their medical records in there that they're getting psychedelic treatments and stuff like that. And they're seeing that the psychedelic treatment is, has been, obviously they wouldn't be dropping out if they weren't seeing the benefit of doing that kind of treatment. Olaf?
Yeah, thanks. I'm thinking about one thing now, continuing this thing with the low-hanging fruit. It's about creativity. There's surely one thing that took me into integral once, like examining how new things could appear. I think of this now because I met a person a few days ago that was playing the piano, and he was a lot into music and did a lot of improvisation. And I played the piano too, but not that much into improvisation. But we were talking about how can you come up with something new and what's really going on there. And I could move us into like, look at the space where that is coming from, and the wordless and the formless. And it was quite fascinating. And that took me into integral like 10 years ago when I was thinking about mathematical objects, and are they always already pre-existing, or wait, there are new systems created all the time. How is that possible? Where is that coming from? And what is that space? So creativity, I think, is central, surely, in this emergence philosophy. But I don't hear people talk about that space so much, not in that way, at least. Do you have any comments on that?
I can just jump in with like a lot of the work with, like, for example, I did the GTC program, Generating Transformative Change, through Pacific Integral, and they kind of embraced Theory U, which is Otto Scharmer's work out of MIT. And the point being that what they talk about is like finding a way to move into generative space. So it's that's the whole key of that whole thing, of the whole Theory U and generating transformative change, which again is an integrally informed movement. And so, yeah, there's in that realm, like in my experience, this generative space, which is like creativity that comes from an embodied realization of something that wants to emerge, something new, something novel that wants to emerge. That's there are a lot of people kind of working in that realm, I would say.
Yeah, and I would just oh, go ahead.
Good, Char.
Yeah, thanks for the reminder about Theory U.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is with the creativity. Saying earlier, it's how can we not only with others, but especially with ourselves, get into a space that's we loosen our grip on our beliefs, our assumptions, our understandings, attitudes. We loosen our grip, and that's not an easy thing to do, but the first step is awareness that this is possible. And so for creativity to come in, we have to make room for it to come in. We kind of have to be predisposed to the okayness of creativity coming in, new thoughts, new awarenesses, new experiences, new awarenesses about those new experiences, all that. And it's like knowing how to get into a hovering place where we're not in our beliefs, we're like almost in an emptiness and a readiness for other stuff to come through. And Pascal last month was addressing this kind of idea quite a bit, like talking to each other in ways that don't make sense. That was an example he was using as to how to get out of our attachedness of our beliefs and our thinking, typical thinking patterns or whatnot and thoughts, to get into that presence that is sort of a looseness to it, being open to a wonder, being open to curiosity, being open to just not knowing, unknowing, just being in that, and the willingness to what might want to show up, what might want to emerge. Yeah.
You know, what strikes me is listening to Eloy and Shara's comments on sacred is if somehow we're invoking the sacred, it clarifies intent. It legitimizes intent so that the message is way more powerful and we don't end up triggering, silo perspectives. So I got to really think about that a little bit more, because somehow to, really skillfully and tactically invoke the sacred, it seems really important.
Wow, that all ties in. What a beautiful comment, question, and Larry and Tom, and goodness, where I feel moving toward this is to cycle back to what was said earlier, I think in response to Christine's question. Just what are our reasons for hope, for optimism? And I totally in line with how Steve McIntosh sees it. I like big history too. And I go into the big history, the storytelling. Creativity is going to arise. We can't stop it. That's the agape. That's the divine, the transcendent, pouring itself into manifestation out of its love and its creative capacity. The creativity in Homo sapiens is that drive that comes to us from the divine, through the divine. It is going to express itself through us. And I loved what Larry was saying about how we can align ourselves and open ourselves to allow it to express through us. But it's going to, this is another riff. I could do a whole TED talk. I won't, I'll spare you. But what Steve McIntosh said, the universe has a 13.8 billion year track record of coming up with next levels of emergences of complexity. It went through the Big Bang and the suns and the chemicals and the planets and the physiosphere, the biosphere, the noosphere. And we've gone through, as I parse it, 6 levels of human culture. Why would we think that evolution, that emergence would stop with us? Why would we think that it's only downhill from here? Talk about arrogance. No, it's not going to stop with us. That divine creativity is going to continue pouring and driving us back through the agape, and now we're on our way back through eros, back to union with the divine. That weaves in the spirituality. This is a sacred circle. It's like a divine circuit. We're part of it. And what I think we're yearning for. And all of what I feel in your question, I'm feeling from the people here, is that we yearn to align ourselves with that, to be in harmony with the divine that wants to express itself through manifestation and then through the return. And how do we align ourselves? And a number of the things Larry was saying was how we individually can align with that. But I feel this energy in everybody here. It's really beautiful.
Amen.
Hallelujah.
Anybody else who hasn't said anything yet like to chime in? Debbie, Eric, Claire, Kat?
Yeah, perhaps just to riff on the theme of not leading with the ideas and the intellectual stuff. What I notice is that there are certain things that have been spoken in here that really touch my heart. And like, how can I stay in resonance with that kind of thing? Because I notice in me sometimes like if I'm wanting to prove how much I know or how smart I am or whatever, and thinking like, do I have a good integral thing to contribute to San Diego Integral Group or whatever, and just to not let that get in the way. But I go back to, like, Karen, what you were saying about the the Ginny Whitelaw thing of like, how do you deal with these people? It's like you fall in love with them. It's like that, it's like, oh, it touched me as it pulls on my heartstrings. And so what I'm looking in all of this is how to be conscious of how I show up in spaces, and how do we together create spaces where these more kind of inspired, heartfelt, creative kinds of energies have room to come in and play. And just watching where I have a choice in any moment. I can come up with something that maybe sounds smart, or I can be more vulnerable with it and go like, yeah, I'm really affected by those kinds of things. And it makes me want to go out, like when I'm walking around the street, how do I meet the person at the post office and be kind? It's like it's not heavy integral theory, but I feel it makes a difference when I move through life that way, and really, just accentuate that other aspect. So that's something that I'm taking away from tonight and wanting to cultivate a little bit. So hear a little background noise there. Debbie, your mic is...
I just wanted to just say something something Eric was sharing, just in my own experience, something that I feel like is transitioning for me, is the realization that sometimes what's coming through me as sacred is kindness and sweet, and sometimes what's coming through is fire, right? Sometimes we have to say the hard things and just not show up as like mean-spirited, but also that I don't have to come with the butterfly feel all the time, because sometimes the moment, because a lot of spiritual, it's the yin and the yang, right? They both exist. And so there's the destructive element and the constructive element. And again, I'm not talking about harm and violence, but there can be this power that is sometimes being asked of us, and to find to be in touch with the moment enough to know, what does this moment want from me? How do I need to show up in this moment? And then honor that. Can I not be concerned about how other people will judge me, right? Maybe it's not something that would normally be said in an environment that I'm in. Am I willing to honor the moment, or am I more interested in my ego and how I'll be judged? And that's something that that's been really growing and shifting for me.
.642, are we out of energy? So see everybody in next month. I can't wait for Karen. It's going to be fun.
Maybe R-rated, not X-rated. Don't get your hopes up too high, Tom.
Okay. If you could zip us both the description and the title, we need to publicize.
Yes, I will be contacting Kathleen in the next in the next few days. We'll set up something and we'll start moving the practicalities forward.
Okay. And thanks, everybody. Great discussion today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
See you all soon.
Thank
Love
you,
you.
Kat, Claire,
Bye.
Debbie.
Bye.
For further information, including upcoming events, resources, links to our Facebook and Meetup pages, and our fabulous donate button, please visit our website at sandiegointegral.org. Donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue to provide information and connection within the Integral community.